Good evening, everyone. My name is Kathy Pierce, and I'm the Director of Programs at the American Nutrition Association, the ANA. We are proud to partner with the Board for Certification of Nutrition Specialists in this program tonight. The ANA would like to thank Bragg Health Foundation for the support of our 2017 Global Webinar Series. Learn more about their mission to inspire and educate people to adopt a healthy lifestyle through optimal nutrition, exercise, positive attitudes, and spiritual wellness at bragghealth.org. The American Nutrition Association is very pleased to be hosting Dr. Deanna Minich tonight to discuss the impact that our food choices can have on the brain, as well as practical strategies to help overcome cravings and emotional eating. Let me take just a moment to tell our audience about the ANA. We are a nonprofit organization which for over 40 years has been on a mission to promote optimal health through nutrition and wellness education. We educate the public and professionals in many ways, including hosting world-class nutrition programs such as this one tonight. We encourage all of you listening this evening to visit our website at theana.org for an abundance of nutrition information, resources, and upcoming webinars. Join the ANA as a member and help us continue to bring these nutrition luminaries to you. And now we are honored to introduce Dr. Deanna Minich. Dr. Deanna Minich is an internationally recognized wellness and lifestyle medicine expert. Her 20 years of experience in the nutrition and functional medicine fields led her to develop an integrated whole self approach to nutrition called Food and Spirit. Dr. Minich received her PhD at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, where she researched essential fatty acid absorption and metabolism. She is a certified nutrition specialist through the Board for Certification of Nutrition Specialists and a fellow of the American College of Nutrition, where she serves on the board of directors. She has authored 5 books on health and wellness and over 15 scientific publications. Currently, she is faculty for the Institute for Functional Medicine and the University of Western States. Her passion is teaching a whole self approach to nourishment and bridging the gaps between science, spirituality, and art in medicine. Welcome, Dr. Minich.
I feel like there should always be some disclaimer and this information that I'm going to be representing to you. And I always think that as a nutrition professional, when you're presenting on food, I want to be sure that you understand that my advocacy is not biased by my eating habits. I think that that's important to establish, right? So I don't believe that people should eat like me. I believe in personalized nutrition. It's more than a belief. It's actually just a fact if you start looking at the science. I operate from the premise that we have a relationship with food. And so what does it mean to have that relationship? We're going to explore that in this presentation. And by the way, don't be too mad at me. I did shuffle up the slides a little bit, and I did insert just a few slides in the beginning. I've also followed many different diets. I think as any nutrition professional or even you as a practitioner, what you want to do is expose yourself to all the different ways of eating and really have that exposure so that when a patient comes to you and says, well, what is it like to follow the elimination diet, that you know specifically not just what those foods are, but what are they going to go through more mental, emotionally. I have also been an emotional eater, overeater, and binger. So I think it's important for you to know that because it very much ties into the work that we're going to be talking about and probably some of the things that we don't like to talk about in nutrition. It's kind of the stuff that makes us uncomfortable, which is why you're all here to learn about those strategies. So here are our objectives for this morning, and they're quite ambitious. We've got lots of material to cover. So the first one is to understand the effect of one's mood on food choices. And that's, again, where I'm going to bring you into the science, take you through that landscape. I'm going to be very practical with you, very clinical, and give you some strategies in order to help you with your patients. How do you make sense of this information that we're learning about in the science and apply it directly? And then finally, I'm going to close with some science around nutrients and the brain. So how can we change awareness, consciousness through the foods that we're taking in? So I think what you're going to see is that I'm very much a whole picture person. I like for us, as we talk about food and eating, to look not only at the left brain, the logic, the studies, but also to take in the right brain, the creative side, the metaphorical information that we get from food and eating. So I'd like you to jog both sides of your brain as we move through this, and I think that both sides of our brain can really find that sense of peace as we move through this area of food and mood. So if you look at the different disciplines that are emerging now, we see that there really is a web that's forming. It's almost like we can't separate out the different systems of medicine, and similarly, we can't separate out the different systems of eating, right? The different layers of eating, as I like to think of it. So it's almost like eating is very much an onion-like process. We can look at it as being very physical. So how many calories did you consume? Or how many grams of fat or carbohydrate or protein? It's also very emotional. How many of you feel like you do have a strong emotional connection with food? Just raise your hand. Yeah, that's why we're all here, right? And we are all, as human beings, feeling that sense of emotions and food. We know that there is a strong connection between the two. Maybe we're not always aware of it, but it's always present. Eating is also very social. There's a lot of good data out there about social networks and how they influence our food and eating behaviors. And then finally, I believe that eating is spiritual. And the way that I define spiritual is that eating gives us the sense that we're all connected in the scheme of life, that we're all one big web. So when we eat something, we're really connecting into the sun, the moon, the stars, all the animals, all the plants, farmers, and everybody that went into the whole process of procuring and providing that food. So there are many layers. And so when you're working with patients, think about that. Where is your patient on that continuum with food and eating? Are they operating more on the physical side with just the information and the nutrient analysis? And sometimes that nutrient analysis can take us into analysis paralysis. I especially see that with a lot of emotional eaters, right? You know, they get really fixated, and sometimes we have to move them along that continuum and allow them to see the big whole, that it's not just calories, but there's something happening to them emotionally through their mood, their behavior in that relationship with food and eating. So one of the things that I've come to after being a PhD nutritionist for so many years is that even though I've spent most of my life studying nutrition, I don't feel like everything around food is only nutrition. It's not, food is medicine for sure, but it's not the only medicine. So when I'm working with patients, what I like to focus on is not just that plate of food that they're eating from and all the different nutrients that are on it, but what's going through their mind as they're eating? What are they feeling as they're eating that meal? And what are they feeling even after that meal, right? So looking again at the whole picture. So as I say here, hold on to a toxic belief in the healthiest diet in the world might not free you from troublesome symptoms. And I see that so much in our fields. You know, I was raised by a mother who was very much into her food and very much into her faith. And so it was all about the stringency of eating, and it was almost like this discipline. And it just felt like the fun was taken out of it. So I almost had to redefine my ways of thinking around food and eating based on the views that I had as a child. And most of those views, when we're children, follow us along as an adult. And I'm going to talk about a clinical tool to get into that a little bit more. So, of course, we always focus on what are we eating? Are we getting enough protein? Did you get your quality fats, if you listen to Dr. Mark Hyman, right? But what most people aren't talking about is the how of eating. In fact, if you think of the most well-studied diet on the planet, anybody know what it is? Just shout it out. Yes, good. It is the Mediterranean diet. I think of the Mediterranean diet and all of the healthful foods that are in that way of eating. But what doesn't get discussed in studies is how they eat in the Mediterranean, right? How relaxed they are. How many of you have been to the 16 countries somewhere in the Mediterranean? So you know so you all kind of know what I'm talking about. Sitting down for hours at a meal and not seeming to gain weight, but having the sense of relaxation, the sense of community and family. I believe that that is so important for our relationship with food. It's not just the what. You know, we always want to put things into a pill and figure it out. Well, is the Mediterranean diet just about the tomatoes? Because let's just take the lycopene and give that to patients, and we're done. We've got the Mediterranean diet. I don't think it's that easy. I think that there's much more behind a dietary pattern than just the foods themselves. So if I think of all the ways that we might eat, and you pick which one is your favorite, there are many, right? And they're not all the same, and we can't treat them in our patients all the same way. So a stressful eater is not necessarily the same as an emotional eater. Then you've got the overeaters, the bingers, the undereaters, the people that don't want to eat, anorexics, all the different types and ways that we eat. We see a lot of this these days, right, in terms of, I call this dashboard dining. So this is where, you know, there is no how of eating here. It's just grab and go. It's convenient. We're often running somewhere, and we're just not taking the time, which means that probably our brain and our mood are going to have different signals than if we were sitting down, having the pleasure of good company and friends, and really relaxed instead of having road rage and trying to juggle everything while we're driving. So I hope that none of our patients have these. Right? To think that anybody would even think to create this is kind of funny and at the same time sad, I suppose. The steering meal. So here's a question I want you to ask your patients. It's one question, but it's probably one of the most powerful questions you can ask them. What is your relationship to food? You can also ask, how is your life going? Because essentially those two questions are going to give you answers for both of them. So when I ask patients, I'll say, you know, what's going on in your life? How is your life right now? Just give me a couple of words about how your life is. Oh, Deanna, I'm so stressed. It's just chaotic. It's just a frenzy. And then I ask them about their food. Stressed, chaotic, I'm in a frenzy. So how we eat is how we live. And how we live is how we eat. So that's why, as practitioners, if you can work on a patient's diet, that's wonderful. Because chances are you're going to be changing their lives. However, let's just say that they're not ready to move to food. If you work on their life and change something in their life, chances are you're going to change something in their eating. Because the two are this matrix. They're a web. They're inseparable. So the foods we eat influence how we feel. There's no, hands down, you're going to walk out of this lecture this morning and really have a sense that, wow, food is really powerful in terms of what we feel in our mood state. So in other words, if we eat crap, we're going to feel like crap. Not going to feel too good, right? And depending on what we're eating, that's going to prime the pump of what we're feeling, which will then cascade over into our food choices. So it's a do loop. It's a never-ending cycle of one going back and forth with the other. And I'm going to try to tease out for you in the science if there's one that precedes the other more strongly. So we'll talk about that. So let's dive into some heady stuff and jog our left brain a little bit and get into some of the more recent science around food and mood. And the way that I did this was I reviewed all of the literature up until November 2015. So basically you have all of the current science on this topic, and that would be anything on emotional eating, stress eating, food and mood relationship, and food and mental health. And I've been following this literature for some time, and what I would say is that it's pretty exciting because We're seeing lots of new studies, lots of developments, and it feels very promising for me to see that more and more scientists and clinicians are putting value and doing something with this whole landscape. I think it's really important for our obesity crisis, our chronic disease crisis, and unearthing a lot of what's going on in that relationship with food. So let's dive in. So this article in the Lancet basically was showing that there is a strong relationship between nutritional quality and mental health, and that there's a protective effect of good eating, good food, healthy diets on depressed mood. You're going to see a lot about depression in these studies. And that there's also new research supporting a detrimental impact of unhealthy eating on mood. So it works both ways. If we're eating really well, chances are we're going to have less depression and better mood. If we're not eating very well, chances are we're going to have a depressed mood and all other types of behavioral issues. So that was set forth in the Lancet. If we look at what we would consider to be an unhealthy diet, right? Pastries, cookies, breads, lots of processed foods. This study looked at that whole terrain of looking at processed food consumption and mood. And it was quite a large study, almost 9,000 people. And what they found was that people that ate fast food, the more fast food that you ate, the greater the risk was for depression. Now, how many of you have seen Super Size Me? Yes? Or even the film that Dr. Mark Hyman was talking about called That Sugar Film. That's a new one. In both of those documentaries, what did they show after 1 month of eating a bad diet? It wasn't just increased visceral adipose tissue and belly fat. It wasn't just increased triglycerides and cholesterol. It was also a depressed mood, right? You could see that their mood had changed throughout the course of this month. So it's very interesting to see how rapidly that can happen. The Mediterranean diet was also studied for its effects on depression, 10,000 different subjects in this study. And essentially what they found is what we would both think, that the more that we adhere to the Mediterranean diet, the less chance we have of being depressed. Now, these researchers went a little bit further to look at, are there certain components of the Mediterranean diet that align even better to reduce depression? And what they found was better mood for fruits and nuts, and if there was a greater monounsaturated to saturated fatty acid ratio, that was also favorable, in addition to legumes. So there's something about these foods, at least in this study, and what they found with depression. So as I was going through the literature, I was curious. You know, being that this is a web and everything is very interconnected, is there one that starts the other? Is it first the food that goes to the mood, or vice versa? And I'll just say that based on what I see in the literature, I don't think that we can answer that question. I think that it's very intertwined. Some researchers would suggest that it is the food side more than the mood side, but I would beg to differ, just based on what I have seen in my own patients and also just looking at the research. I don't feel like that's conclusive. But there are some studies that will definitely support that and really have that as their framework. So just want you to know that going into these. So this was a meta-analysis. So it was looking at 33 different studies, including almost 2,500 participants. And what they found was that negative mood was associated with greater food intake, especially in people that were restrained eaters. So when you see any talk of restrained eaters as I go through these studies, what that means is that those people were told not to have certain things or to eat in a certain way. So think of all the patients that we have that we tell to eat in a certain way, especially when I think of the elimination diet or certain caloric frameworks for people to follow and ranges. So there's increased negative mood. We have to be thinking about that relationship with food for our patients as we put them on a diet where they're restrained. I think that's really key. Positive mood. Now, we always think, probably before you came to this talk, you were thinking, well, gosh, negative mood, depression, anxiety, all these things are probably associated with food and eating. Yes, they are. But so is positive mood. So when we're feeling really good and joyous and we feel like celebrating, what do we tend to do? We tend to go and eat, right? So it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be having those good positive moods, but there is a tendency to have these vacillations with mood and eating. Now, the difference between the two, as you will see, is that positive mood usually doesn't have those lasting effects that something like a negative mood does. So if we have a positive mood, typically it's more temporal and we have a response, and then we go back to our baseline. Whereas negative mood can carry on much further. It has a bit more staying power, which can be more dangerous and not so good. So these researchers would assert that foods come first and then moods. You're going to see that in a lot of these studies, what they did is they had college students as the subjects, which I think is actually quite good because they are under these circumstances of having set periods of stress, and yet they're pretty healthy, right? They're still really young and robust. So we don't have all the complicating factors of chronic disease and other markers. So these college students completed 7-day records of foods and moods, and what the researchers found was that the negative moods, they could definitely see that foods were aligned with mood states, and that this would happen just as soon as 2 days of changing their food regimen. So just like Supersize Me, I don't think it takes 30 days in order to see these effects on depression. I think it can happen very rapidly. I think you can change somebody's mood just after one meal. You know this for yourself. So if we continue to eat a certain way, we're going to have sustained effects of that mood on the patient. So with this particular study, they were looking at the negative mood state, and they found more calories, saturated fat, and sodium consumed by the students, and more negative mood. Now, one of the reasons why I show you disclaimers about my eating style is that you're going to see a number of these different foods that are correlated with mood, including things like meat. So I want us to kind of look at this in the broad context of different quality of food versus the individual constituents, right? So you'll see that as we move through. People in a lowered mood state are less likely to focus on the future. So this is one of the points of rationale as to why people make these decisions around food. So if you're feeling like you're in a bad mood, chances are you're not thinking, oh, you know, I need to feel better, I'm going to eat differently, and this is going to impact my future, my week ahead. No, typically when you're in a bad mood, it can really sink you down. You know, it's kind of the downward spiral. And I've seen this in patients over and over again, especially overeaters and bingers who have a binge event, and then they feel even more depressed. And what happens? They continue, and then they have another event of binging and not eating really good foods. Positive mood, if we can keep our patients in that positive mood, whatever that takes, and maybe those are just simple strategies, and we'll talk about some of those, increases the likelihood that the individual will be thinking more in the future. So yes, positive mood can lead to increased caloric intake, but typically somebody in a positive mood is thinking more future-oriented. You know, they're not going to be taking themselves down into that spiral like somebody in a negative mood. Here was a study looking at 2 different dietary interventions. Very simple study looking at a snack, and either the subjects had a piece of fruit or a chocolate crisp type of snack. So what they did was they had these students, 100 students, complete questionnaires. Then they were randomly assigned to either the chocolate crisp or the fruit. And these students consumed the snack for 10 days, every day. And interesting enough, I mean, they didn't have the rest of their diet changed. It was just the snack that had changed. Keep that in mind. What they found was that consumption of chocolate was associated with greater emotional eating and depression. whereas eating the fruit was associated with lower anxiety, depression, and emotional distress. I just find that fascinating because here they are, not changing their overall diet, just adding in probably 80 to 100 calories per day, and seeing so much of a dramatic shift in mood. So the power of even one food to change our mood state for days on end. Let's talk a little bit about stress. This is something that I see a lot in patients. In fact, when I'm working with patients, I have them do a questionnaire. And based on the questionnaire, which has 7 sections, I can see where I most need to go in terms of their relationship with food. And 80% of patients score high on the stress section. So it's important for us to be looking at stress and looking at what we can do to have that conversation about stress. So not everybody is subject to eating when they're stressed. You know, I have some patients who stop eating when they're stressed. It's almost like they go on alert. You know, their body is so much in survival mode that they stop eating. And then I have other people who, when they're stressed, they just start making very poor food choices. Convenient foods, foods on the run, convenient snacks of all types because, you know, there's something that's fueling them. Perhaps it's work stress and they've got deadlines and things that they've got to do, and so they're not as focused on their food. There are different types of people who react to stress differently. So you have what's called the high stress reactors. You know, I see these as the type A's, right? The type A people, like myself, you know, we're going to have a different relationship with food. We may be drawn after a stressful event to something that's very food connected. Whereas somebody that is not such a stress reactor, like a type B, may not have that same relationship. By the way, there are 2 other personality types that have emerged in the literature. So there's type A, the high reactor, the heat, you know, very stressed out type of person. Then you've got the type B, who's the very relaxed. There's type C, which is the type of person, as they define it in the literature, a person that doesn't like conflict. Just think of the C in type C for the type that doesn't like conflicts. And so they store in a lot of that emotional unrest. And then type D is the depressed type. So the type that feels very apathetic, very withdrawn, very introverted in that downward spiral and unable to make a lot of change. So the ones that I'm talking about here are more the type A, but you can imagine that type C and type D would also have these types of eating issues, some dysfunctional eating patterns. When we look at patients in women specifically with eating disorders, what we see is that cortisol is elevated. So we know already that there's a lot of stress in these patient groups. So stress is really, I would say, a state of when we're incoherent. And so as we get into the clinical strategies, I want to take you through some of the modalities that will move patients into coherence, meaning that head, heart, and gut are all synced up and rhythmic. So breathing is synced up with thinking and brain waves, and those 2 are synced up with metabolic flexibility and that ease in the gut. And for many people, this is where they feel a lot of emotion. So how do we bring them into that state of coherence versus incoherence? And we know that having high cortisol, if that's the case with patients, is not such a good thing, right? Cortisol causes all kinds of metabolic imbalance. We see increased blood sugar, we see weight gain, and these types of things are only going to perpetuate, potentially, things like emotional eating and mood disturbances. So I thought it would be interesting because I am very interested in net dietary acid load. So looking at the overall nutrient composition of a meal to look at the positive and negative ion balance. And there was some initial literature showing that cortisol, increases in cortisol could be blunted by having a diet that was a bit more alkalizing. So alkalizing meaning more like green leafy vegetables versus a lot of animal products, a lot of meat, eggs, and dairy. So this study, so I decided to look into that a little bit just to see if there was any data. This study in particular was 9 healthy subjects. They neutralized the diet. They didn't change the diet. They just added in bicarbonate supplementation for 7 days. And this helped to reduce cortisol. So isn't that interesting that something that we might have to alkalize our eating, I'm thinking magnesium, I'm thinking calcium, I'm thinking the minerals, might actually ward off some of that elevated cortisol. Here's another study looking at a very similar concept to see if mood could be improved by a diet that was high in potassium, which would be seen as being more alkalizing. So there were 3 dietary approaches that were tested. So low sodium, high potassium diet, a high calcium diet, and then a moderate sodium, high potassium, high calcium. This is the DASH diet that I know that many of you have heard of, which has actually been quite well received. And there are a number of excellent literature articles on the DASH diet. So these subjects were randomized to 2 diets for 4 weeks, each preceded by a 2-week control diet, and then they measured mood and cortisol. And what they found was that it was the low sodium, high potassium diet, not the DASH diet, but it was simply just looking at the sodium potassium ratio in that balance that led to a favorable mood. So I just think that this is interesting. I know I inserted here a little bit more on the nutrition side, but the fact of having a diet that has tailored nutrients, whether it's supplements or even getting those nutrients from the food themselves, and how that can change mood, right? So something as easy as sodium and potassium ratio could have that effect. What about comfort eaters? So do people that eat for comfort actually get more comfort from eating? Well, based on this study, the answer would be yes. So for people that are typically comfort eaters, when they do eat based on a stressful event, they will receive much more comfort than a person who is not typically a comfort eater. So there is something about that. So looking here at clinical strategies, some of the things that you could do would be have the patient move towards things that give them comfort other than food, right? And there are many different options, and you could brainstorm with them. You could make a list, have that list available so that when they are not feeling comfortable or they have distress or they have stress, here are your go-to strategies, right? Really important to have that. So let's dive into emotional eating as part of the discussion on mood, because this is, again, a huge feature of everything that we see on nutrition. I think we can't ignore this anymore. In fact, I read somewhere that over 75% of overeating is due to emotional reasons. Let me just repeat that because I think it's a staggering statistic that over 75% of overeating is due to emotional reasons. So we look at things like overweight, obesity, eating disorders. You know, what are the emotional underpinnings there? So the way that I define emotional eating is a little bit broad, and I have 2 different ways to look at it. The first one is, instead of feeling something and emoting, we eat. We take it down. I have a friend, not a patient, but a friend, who told me the story of how every time she would get in a fight with her husband, he would stop talking and he would go to the freezer and pull out ice cream and just sit at the kitchen table and start eating ice cream. It's almost like a frozen moment. You know, no talking, just cold and shut down. So I was asking her, I said, so what is his relationship with his mother? You know, tell me a little bit about that. And she just started laughing. She goes, oh my goodness, I can't believe you would ask that because it's so relevant. You know, just not having that nurturing relationship and just feeling really closed off. So I gave her some tips as to how she could work with him on the ice cream. And actually just create some fun around it rather than having it be so somber and serious, right? Maybe sharing in the ice cream with him. Or, you know, so many different things that she's tried. So, you know, really looking at why are people doing certain things? Where did that behavior come from? And then having feelings about eating. So food aversion. So you might have had the experience yourself where either you feel really emotional about a certain food because it was part of your upbringing and you always had it. Or there might be certain foods that you had bad experiences with, and then you have this emotion about that food. Okay, this is very common in the world of eating disorders, talking about food aversion, and even for children who rapidly form those food aversions based on their experiences. So how do we get to be like this? Have we always been emotional eaters? Can animals be emotional eaters too, or is it just a human thing? So I would say, these are just some of my ideas. I don't think that we make the time to feel. I know that that's going to sound very interesting, but we live in a very intellectual society where it's all about the head, not so much about the heart. And so I think that because of our intellect and where we have been and where we're going, we just don't value and look at feelings as something that's strong. Those are the things you want to hide. Don't put all your feelings out there for everybody to see. So I think because of that, in part, and how we approach feelings, whereas if you go to the Mediterranean, what do you see? I mean, everybody is emotional, and, it's just almost too much for me. So, you see the opposite. So it just depends on the culture, where you come from, what the family is like, and how you were raised. And I also think that many people are out of touch with their bodies. It's kind of an ironic statement. How can somebody be out of touch with their body? But I see this over and over again with patients. They're not in touch. They're reading every book, trying to figure out their food, and they're not really listening within. They're not really intuitive eaters. So I want to, again, move into that space as we talk about clinical strategies. And, really and truly, it's not always safe to be showing your feelings, right? Sometimes it feels better just to take it on yourself and stuff it down with food, and you'll change your neurochemistry when you do that. You'll have that dopamine response and maybe some serotonin, and you'll just feel better. So I think in some ways it's a coping strategy for many people. So as I mentioned, we project emotions onto food for release, and foods represent certain emotions. I did an activity with a patient some years ago, and she had this thing about potato chips. And she couldn't understand where it came from, but she would always have this bag of potato chips with her, even if she was traveling, or, she told me how she went to go be with her daughter while her daughter was having her baby, and, it was going to be this big event. She stacked the car with her potato chips. So I did an activity with her, and I'm going to tell you about this activity. Maybe we'll even all do it together, and had her get a little bit deeper into her relationship with potato chips. And what we found out from this exploration, which took all of 10 minutes to do, was that the potato chips were not really about the potato chips. They were about when she was 12 years old. She was the only child. She was left at home by her parents while they went off to a movie, and they left her with a bag of potato chips and dip. She had completely forgotten that even occurred until we went into this, more or less, this subconscious activity where we get into that space of that food. She burst out crying. She had no realization that she was just continually targeting and going back to that place of comfort with the potato chips. So she wrote me a card afterward. I mean, she was just so happy. It almost felt like she could be liberated from that experience, right? It's very powerful when that happens. Because sometimes those cravings, those sensations that we have with food can feel like this. And I'm showing chocolate specifically because that's mine. How many of you have chocolate as your craving of choice? Okay. Yeah. So mixed bag on that. So this is another study showing that, and this was in female students, that there were emotional eating events that happen more so after a sad event or having a sad mood than after the joy mood condition, but still having a little bit after the joy mood. And I think what it is, my takeaway from the literature is, if you're an emotional eater, it's anything that's emotional that's going to grab you and potentially lead you down this path of eating something. Now, the second point that they found was that emotional eating was connected more to sweet food. Now, every time we had a craving, If it was for broccoli, that'd be a really good thing, and I wouldn't even be presenting here today. We'd all be in the sulforaphane talk, right? But it's not about broccoli. Typically, these things are more in line with sugar, things that are sweet, very saccharine. In this study, they looked at a variety of different mood states and found that there was a significant increase in food intake for emotional eaters in the positive compared to the neutral condition, and a trend towards higher food consumption than non-emotional eaters. So again, more or less the same thing. When we're feeling really excited or really negative, this is where we see changes in our eating. In this study, they looked at women and had them rate their emotions. And they found that there were these 4 clusters of emotional states. And what they found with them is that there was more motivation to eat during the negative periods. One of the things that I have patients do is really focus on their blood sugar. I think that this is important because if their blood sugar is not stable, what's going to happen? Right? It's all over the place. So the glucose will be low. You'll be reaching for something that's high in sugar. So for people with stable blood sugar, what we see is typically that there's not a lot in the way of food cravings. But if there's low blood sugar, then we see an increased preponderance towards reaching for something that's high in sugar. And that makes sense, right? So I talked about restrained eaters. These are people that aren't allowed to eat certain foods. And this study looked at restrained eaters and found that they have greater emotional responsivity, greater neuroticism, greater anxiety, greater depression, and lower self-esteem. So I think it's so important when we're counseling and working with patients on new ways to eat that we focus on their mood state. So how do they feel about that dietary change? Having that conversation. Because if we don't open up that conversation and then just give a prescription, we don't know about compliance or how that will be followed, or long-term, how their mood might change. And that can all play into the picture of health. Similarly, bingers experience greater fluctuations of anxiety and depression than non-bingers, and overweight individuals experience greater fluctuations in all these different emotions relative to normal weight individuals. So already, if you have patients that are obese, overweight, or they have eating disorders, just assume that there's lots of emotional reactivity. In fact, you may even want to work on some of those aspects first before you dive into a particular diet. Sometimes I've had to do that with people and get them ready on the more mental, emotional level before taking them into a nutritional program or plan. I think that that's good just to set that foundation. As I mentioned before, for people that binge or overeat, one of the things that you want to do is break that cycle, because the poor mood that follows a binge can just perpetuate another binging event. And what we see here, at least from this study, and I've seen this before with people, is that negative mood and hunger were higher at pre-binge than at non-binge times, and that negative mood was even higher post-binge. So that feeling of guilt. Guilt is the emotion that I see most with patients after having something like these very reactive emotional eating events. So I looked a little bit further into the gut response, and I'm going to show you some research on that. This study I had never seen until I started looking into the literature a little bit more. Was looking at people that had a sad emotion and the role of fat. Now this is fascinating. What they did was they took people who, under certain circumstances, they evoked a sad mood, and then gave them an intragastric infusion of certain fatty acids. And what they found was that the sad emotion that was created in the situation that they had them in was reduced by having this fat injected into them, into their stomach. So there's that sense of perhaps changes in neuropeptides, changes in satiety factors, that feeling of having something in the belly and feeling calm and satisfied, and how that can change the emotional state. So I'd like to see a study where we look at an infusion of things like certain carbohydrates or certain proteins. And of course, we know that proteins and all of these macronutrients really do play a role in mood and cognition. Candace Pert has put out so many great articles, and even her book, Molecules of Emotion, looking at the different gut peptides that are produced by way of eating or by way of being emotional. So seeing the gut as an emotional system. You know what I think is really fascinating is how intrigued we are as a species now, as a society, with the gut. This has almost become the age of the gut. You know, everything is about the gut microbiome and focusing on probiotics, which I think is fantastic. And I see the gut as a metaphor for the emotional system. Because we think about conditions like irritable bowel syndrome. What are we irritated about? Or inflammatory bowel disease. What are we inflamed about? Why do we have all this inflammation in our bellies? Why, when we feel emotional, we feel like we have butterflies in the stomach or this kind of unrest in the gut? For many patients, this is their place of where they do have a lot of emotional response, right? So helping the gut, priming the gut with a 5-hour program, looking at things like probiotics and fibers can eventually go back and change mood because the gut is signaling the brain. So if we want to work on emotions with our patients and start there, that might be a really good place to start, right? Is to focus on the gut and see what you can do in the way of changing up their supplements, their lifestyle in such a way that they feel more calmness in their gut. Because leaky gut connects to leaky brain. So if we have issues in the gut and we don't have a very good, solid gut barrier, and so we're letting lots of things through and we're having lots of inflammation, we might also see a lot of cognitive changes as well. So one of the things that I also found with gut hormones was that in this study they looked at the role of smell. And I'm intrigued with the role of smell and taste. There's a lot about taste receptors that we're seeing now. So they took women with extreme weight and eating conditions versus controls, and they looked at smell and taste. They didn't find much in the way of taste, but they did find that smell capacity was impaired in people that were obese and increased in people with anorexia. The people that needed the food had even more acute smell, and people that were obese, again, did not have that same intensity in smell, which I thought was fascinating. All right, so just a few more on emotional eating. Some of the science would tell you that the foods that we're drawn to when we are feeling emotional are sweet, high-energy dense foods. So things like cake and ice cream, salty, high-energy dense foods like chips and soda. You know, all the snack foods, all the things that are convenient and that involve just quick hand-to-mouth activity. Same thing in this study. Higher emotional eating was associated with higher consumption of energy-dense snacks, and in particular, the consumption of sweet and fatty foods across most categories. And for women that already had depression, this was even more strong, this connection. Eating chocolate may feel good initially, but then after having that emotional eating event, after eating the chocolate, the experience of a bad mood can be prolonged. So, you know, for my patients that have these chocolate fixations, even for myself, what I counsel them on is really focusing on a good quality product, right? So if you are going to have chocolate, celebrate it. Have that square, make it the best chocolate ever, and feel really good about it. Because many patients, what they'll do is they'll eat in secret. They'll eat in hiding. And this only propagates the whole cycle, right? So bringing it out. I remember I was working with Dr. Jack Kornberg some time ago, and we had a patient like this, a man actually, a 62-year-old Vietnam vet who was so fixated on chocolate, so, and that doesn't always happen, right? But he was feeling really uncomfortable about it. And I remember Dr. Kornberg telling him, if you're going to have the chocolate, bring out your finest china, put the chocolate on there, sit at the table, make time for it. Just don't, you know, put it in the mouth quickly, chew it, and then you'll just want more. Really create the how of eating around that occasion. One of the things that I've noticed as well, and this is supported in the research, is that individuals who have greater difficulty making sense of their emotional state, where they don't really know how they feel, have less ability to regulate those emotions. So one of the first things that I'll ask an emotional eater is I'll continually ask them, how do you feel right now? And typically what I'll get is fine, okay. And you know that that's not really the answer, right? So then you try to unearth that a little bit more. I'm going to show you one of the tools that I use for creating more of a lexicon around emotions, because I feel like we've lost some of that. Many times when I'll do a workshop with a number of women, and I'll have them just go around and just say, like, how do you feel? Sometimes I'll hear words like, I'm concentrating, I'm focused. And I'm thinking to myself, and then I tell them later, I say, well, are those really emotional states? Right? So sometimes we're so at a loss of where we feel, we become so much in the head that we have lost that sense of how we feel in the heart. So then we go back and we kind of redo that circle, and how do you really feel now? Not that you're concentrating, but how do you feel? So that's one of the first things with creating steps to emotional eating techniques is, number one, just have that sense of bodily awareness and feeling awareness. I thought that this was a very interesting study looking at adolescents with type 1 diabetes matched to controls. And what they found here was that those with type 1 diabetes had significantly lower intuitive eating scores compared to controls. But for those that were more intuitive eaters and that had a good sense of regulation with their bodies, they had better hemoglobin A1C relative to those that did not have that same intuitive eating sense, that were also type 1 diabetic. So there's something to be said here about the connection between being intuitive, and it's hard to be intuitive when you've got dysfunction and pathology, right? Because you may feel like moving towards sugar, but that may be the pathology talking. So counseling patients on intuitive eating is really important. It's important how you do that specifically. This is such a fun one. This was I enjoyed reading this study. It was looking at men at a hockey game. And they created these hockey games so that there were 4 wins, 3 losses, and 1 tie game. And then they had them eat after the event just to see how they would experience the food. It's just interesting that the researchers would ever come up with this design. And what they showed was that after the wins, after there was a win for the hockey game, that the men experienced that sweet foods were sweeter and that sour foods were more sour. So taste had changed. Taste perception had changed. Whereas when there was a loss, when the game showed a loss for the team that they were rooting for, the sweetness became less and the sour became less. So isn't that interesting that our mood state, our emotions at an event can change our perception of a meal? What about being bored? Do you ever ask your patients if they're bored? Yeah, I'm seeing some head nods. I can't believe anybody could be bored, but there are some people that feel like eating when they're bored. They have nothing better to do. So in this study, they looked at eating in response to boredom, and they found that it was more common than eating in response to anxiety or depression. So if you've got nothing better to do, that feeling of, well, I might as well get something to eat. So being prone to being bored and also having issues with emotional regulation are 2 things when they come together that they potentiate each other. So then we see even more inappropriate eating behavior. Same thing here with emotional eating, and I like to see some men included in these studies. Typically you see either college students or you just see women. But this one in particular was looking at men and women, and they found that emotional eating and depression were positively correlated, and both were related to higher body mass. Now, what they found out about the men versus the women was that men gravitated to non-sweet foods in these emotional eating events. In fact, I've noticed that with patients that men typically like to have savory foods and women tend to gravitate towards sweet foods. It's not always the case, but in emotional eating, we might tend to see that polarity a little bit. At least that's what this study brought out. Uncontrolled eating is also associated with reduced memory or cognition. It's almost like the brain is just kind of goes haywire, right? All this emotion, lots of activity in the amygdala, changes in neurotransmitters, and this can change working memory. Loss of control. So this is one of the aspects that I like to focus on with patients is the locus of control. So instead of saying to them, I'd like you to follow the elimination diet, what I might say instead is, I'd love for you to be off of these foods. Which ones would you like to go off of first? Giving them a choice. Because many people with emotional eating and mood disorders feel that loss of control, that they have no decision making in the process, or at least they don't feel comfortable about their decisions. So I think that when we come from that place of asking them rather than telling them, that turns the table and really sets a different tone to the mood of the discussion. And then finally, ovarian hormones. You know, you're probably wondering, why isn't she mentioning all the hormonal influences on mood and eating? And I looked into that literature a bit, and there is some, but not a lot. So in people that are already binge eaters or have emotional eating tendencies, yes, there does seem to be a role of different ovarian hormones. So dysregulated hormones or eating more during times of the cycle where there's higher progesterone is what the study had shown. So just a couple of studies on personality that I thought you might find interesting. I've already alluded to the type A, type B, type C, type D. And in this study, and we're seeing a lot more of these types of studies, is classifying personalities or behaviors and looking at chronic conditions or looking at health states. So this was a almost 951 people from the general population, and some of the associations that they saw were high openness to experience, which I love how they phrase these terms, were associated with higher fruit, vegetable, and salad, and lower meat and soft drink consumption. Interesting. High agreeableness was associated with low meat consumption. Now, don't walk away from the slide and say, well, Deanna must not like eating meat. This is just simply what we see in the literature, right? Kind of these patterns. But of course, we need to look a little bit deeper at what is at the base of that. But at the high level, if we look at personality, we are seeing these trends. Conscientiousness mainly promoted fruit consumption by promoting restrained eating and prevented meat consumption by reducing external eating. And then they looked at neuroticism, extroversion, and essentially what you see here is what we saw in the previous studies, a greater tendency towards choosing foods that are high intensity sweet and full of calories. So this word that I'm seeing, conscientiousness, I think it's one of those double-edged sword terms because in the world of eating disorders and mood imbalance, what we see is also a lot of perfectionism. So either it's being conscientious to the point of where it's serving an individual, or it has turned the tide into something that's a little bit more rigorous. But in general, it can work to our patient's favor. So I just had to include these two studies. Very interesting to look at chronotypes. How many of you ask your patients if they're morning or night people? Do you ever ask that? One person, two, three people. Really interesting to see that morning people, like the morning larks, morning birds, if you will, tend to have higher alertness throughout the day and also lower depression and lower emotional eating. I don't know why that is, but I find it very interesting to think that there is that correlation. Same thing, eveningness. So patients that are a little bit more, the night owl, they tend to have, what do you think? We know this intuitively, right? Greater emotional eating. There's even a new syndrome that they call nighttime eating syndrome, NES. So people eating more calories, more foods at night. And these are not, again, the broccoli, the kales, or the Brussels sprouts. These are the snack foods that they're eating. Okay, so what I'd like to do here is go a little bit deeper into some of the modalities so you have some takeaways. I've been trying to pepper a lot of the research with some different clinical tools, and so I hope that you've extracted some of those. But what I would like to do now is go a little bit more deep into the different modalities and maybe even have you experience some of those. So one thing to acknowledge as we move down this path is the interrelationship between mind and body. There is much more of a connection than we've ever seen in the literature. And I would think that for any of us that are in the field and have worked with a deep breathing practice or meditation or mindfulness, we can see the ripple through effects of these practices on somebody's life, especially eating. So bringing mindfulness to eating is really being aware and paying attention. And that's really what it is, very simply. Because we're not paying attention. Most people aren't. Most of your patients, when they're eating, they're doing something else. They're either watching television, as we can see here, 91% of people watching television when eating meals at home. 61%, 62% are sometimes or often too busy to sit down and eat. So how do we just create that space of a dedicated eating occasion? So eating rate, if we look at how does this translate, if we're doing multiple things at once, are we even paying attention to how we're chewing? In this study, what they showed was that children that were overweight or obese tended to take more eating bites per minute versus their normal weight or underweight counterparts. And they went further on in the study to talk about how the parents of those children had a similar eating rate. And that makes sense, right? You're all sitting around the table. Hurry up. Go faster. Come on, everybody's finishing. So, we establish those familial patterns around eating very early on. If you like this whole area of food and mood and looking at mindful eating, check out Dr. Brian Wansing's book called Mindless Eating. He goes through many different studies that they've done at their lab at Cornell and talks about the results of those studies, which are fun to see. This one in particular, he talks about how 5 minutes after dinner, 31% of people leaving an Italian restaurant couldn't remember how much bread they ate. And 12% of bread eaters denied that they had any bread at all. So we're really not aware. People think they eat 28% less than they actually eat. And if you're obese or overweight, you tend to think that you eat even less than you actually have eaten. So being attentive might be a really good thing. In fact, there was this meta-analysis looking at 24 different studies, and they showed that eating when distracted produced a moderate increase in immediate intake, but increased later intake to a greater extent. So if we're not aware, chances are we're probably just going to be eating more. So there are lots of different mind-body medicine interventions to choose from. A lot of great ones that have been well studied by John Kabat-Zinn, by Dr. Herbert Benson, a variety of different ones out there. And what we know is that based on their research, that mindfulness can be a wonderful technique, a wonderful way to approach a meal and help to reduce binge eating and emotional eating. Here's one of my favorite studies. I'm sure all of us have type 2 diabetic patients. This study looked at glycemic control in type 2 diabetics, implemented a 12-week mindfulness training, didn't change the diet, only did the mindfulness training, and saw significant reductions in hemoglobin A1C just after 8 weeks. Isn't that fantastic? So you can see here what the results are. We know that the relaxation response is powerful. It's powerful because it's changing all these different body systems. So not is it just making us feel better, but it's changing genes associated with energy metabolism, mitochondrial function. I always tell patients that if they're breathing deeply when they're eating a meal, then chances are they're going to oxidize and burn that meal better for fuel because we have oxygen and because they're much more relaxed. One of the things that I've noticed in these studies, just overall, is that the more that we get into those states of relaxation or we do mindfulness practice, the more that our bodies tend to go there quicker, faster. And that we see better, more favorable gene changes in those populations that are doing it repeatedly versus those that are just kind of doing it sporadically. And of course, that makes good intuitive sense, but the science backs it up. So let's all just take a breath. This is just one simple thing, right? So there are many different breathing techniques. So one of the very easy ones that I teach people is to inhale for 4, hold for 4, release for 4, and hold that expiration for 4 before you take your next breath. So I'd like them to think about a box, that they're drawing this box in their mind's eye as they're taking that breath. Or what they can also do is, just like the woman in the picture, put the hand on the belly and feel that breath coming in and feeling the low gut, because many people are breathing very superficially, really not having that deep and anchored. So just even doing that before a meal, coming into their centeredness a bit better, is very good for just grounding them in the eating experience. So the relaxation. The relaxation response is something that Dr. Herbert Benson created. It's very simple. One of the first things that I mention to patients when they're sitting down to eat a meal is, number one, first and foremost, don't cross your arms, don't cross your legs. Many of us are really pretzeled up, right? And we're kind of hunched over the table, and we don't have that good flow, oxygenation, circulation to the legs. We might be wearing high heels. We might be wearing, whatever that makes us not feel really connected to our feet. So really getting them centered and sitting and feeling comfortable before they're just about ready to make a decision from the menu. So it's a simple practice, but there's actually good science to show that being in that power pose, sitting there with your arms uncrossed, your legs uncrossed, shoulders back, if you're like that for 2 minutes, you can change your biochemistry. That's the work of Dr. Amy Cuddy at Columbia, who showed increases in testosterone and reductions in cortisol from maintaining what she calls that power pose for 2 minutes. So if we have high testosterone and low cortisol, that's really the seat of power, right? Where we will feel more engaged and empowered to make a good decision. We know that relaxation translates into reducing emotional eating. There are studies on that we can reduce the number of emotional eating episodes, we can reduce depression, anxiety. This is an old study, but I always come back to this. People always want to know, well, don't I just chew my food really well and just be done with it? But in this study, they looked at people that were relaxed versus chewing food well. And then they looked at combinations thereof. And they found that people that were more relaxed did better in digesting carbohydrate than people that just chewed their food really well. So isn't that interesting, right? That we have then the proper pancreatic enzymes, the proper secretions in order to digest our food. So I love the idea of forest bathing. So this is what we have seen in the literature around nature changing up our physiology, whether it's our blood pressure, our cortisol, our heart rate, just being in nature. So if a patient doesn't live close to something like a forest or can go hiking very easily, typically what I'll recommend is, can you be in a park? Just having that connection to nature, being outside, just noticing the trees. I have one of my teachers always says, well, we always have the sky. It doesn't always have to be a forest, but, how do we connect with nature? We can always look up, we can look at clouds, anything to really connect us and have that feeling of awe and wonder, I think is important. And there's good science, especially on the forests. If most of us are eating when we're watching television, I would like to be thinking about how is that television program changing our physiology, which then ripples into how is it changing our digestion and our metabolism of that meal. I think about that with a lot of young children watching violent movies, horror movies, aggressive movies. This was a study, and I was so glad to find this, even though it's an older study. I keep hanging on to this one too, because the power of what our visual cues are and how that can change our biochemistry. So this was a study in 20 healthy young women, and essentially emotional arousal from this movie was associated with changes in cardiovascular parameters. So it's almost like our brain doesn't know the difference between seeing something visually and experiencing it. We still provoke those responses. Think of a nightmare. Your heart starts beating fast, you might be sweating, but you're not actually experiencing anything. That's just in the mind. So that's why I believe that guided imagery and doing visualizations with patients is really important for helping them to come into that space of feeling like they do have that locus of control. Mood and surroundings. I put this in here because, I guess probably the best way to explain it is a story. I had a patient a number of years ago, and I remember that she didn't like to cook. She had a lot of emotional eating issues with food. And I just had asked her, in conversation, I said, well, tell me a little bit about your kitchen. She says, it's all white. It's very sterile. I don't like it. And I said, well, what is your favorite color? And she said, right away, she said, sage green. And I said, well, what would happen if you painted your kitchen sage green? And she said, well, that's an interesting idea. So she comes back 3 weeks later, and she was just on cloud nine. She was in a great mood, and I had asked her what she had done, and she mentioned that she had painted her kitchen. That just changing the color of her kitchen, she put some knickknacks and dressed it up a little bit and made it her sanctuary, which I thought was really beautiful because she didn't have that warm and fuzzy feeling around food and eating. So I was trying to think, well, how can I bring in the mood through color or other things in her environment? So thinking about environment is worthwhile. What music are we listening to while we're eating a meal? How is that changing our mood and changing our food choices? Slow food, you probably have heard of this, right? The idea of moving slower with food. If you go anywhere in Europe, they really do have this type of eating, right? Sometimes you have to ask for the check because everything is just so slow moving. Whereas in the US, we have this very fast pace. But there are some restaurants catching on to just being much more in the moment and taking time. Spiritual well-being. So I mentioned in the beginning that eating can also be spiritual or have this sense of everybody and everything being connected. And so spiritual growth and well-being seems to help reduce depression and anxiety. I thought I would put this study in just because it seemed appropriate for the spiritual side. Very interesting study. So this was Dr. Dean Radin's work, and he's done a lot with intentionality and mood and food. And in this study that was in 2013, there were 189 adults, and for each evening, for 7 days in a row, they recorded their mood states. And then on days 3, 4, and 5 of the test, every participant was given oolong tea in the morning and then again at night. And all the while, they're monitoring their mood. One group blindly received tea treated or applied intention by 3 Buddhist monks. The other group blindly received untreated tea, so no blessing or no prayers. On the last day of the test, the subjects were asked which tea they thought they were drinking. And it seemed that, and again, they didn't know which group they were in, but those that were drinking the tea that was treated, if you will, by the monks seemed to feel better in their mood. And when they knew that they had the tea that was blessed by the monks, their mood was even greater. So there seems to be some connection there. I actually had a phone call with Dr. Radin to ask him about this study and some of his other work. And it's really hard to explain why we would have these effects. I don't think that we have any good scientific explanations, but it makes sense if somebody thinks that their food has been blessed, that might affect their mood. But isn't it interesting that even not knowing could affect mood? I think it's also good to bring out humor as a food substitute. Making light of food and one's relationship with eating. I remember reading that one good burst of laughter is something like 15 calories of expenditure of our energy. So not only is it good for us, but we're actually metabolizing and feeling better. As far as emotional eating goes, I do have some specific techniques here. Anything emotional needs to be in motion, really. You look at the word emotion, energy, and motion, and the more that we have these emotional regulation techniques, the healthier we will be. In fact, I always find that this study is very staggering. Again, an older study, but showing that those that were able to regulate their mental and emotional states were able to live longer and have better quality of life. Crying is a good thing. In fact, in this study, they had patients with rheumatoid arthritis and had them watch a movie, and then at the end of the movie, they were to gauge whether or not they cried, how they felt, what was their mood. And essentially what they showed was that the people that were more prone to cry tended to have better reduction of symptoms overall, or at least be better in control of their symptoms. And when I looked into crying a little bit more in the literature, I saw that this is quite amazing to think that we release inflammatory cytokines in our tears. So maybe the body needs to cool off. Maybe we need to release those tears in some way, right? Because we have to get rid of those cytokines. So very important to feel the feelings. We talk about them. We might send patients for talk therapy, but how effective? How do we get those things moving through us? Because if we don't, they manifest in many different ways. And I mentioned food and eating, but we might see all other behaviors as well. So maybe over shopping, or always keeping busy, or over intellectualizing. That's a very common one, right? So this may eventually lead to symptoms. So feeling fatigued, feeling depressed. Many times I think we think of nutrition when we think of a patient with depression, and maybe it would be worthwhile to have a conversation about just what emotional stuff is going on, if that's within your scope of practice, of course. So it can manifest anywhere in the body. And many of the messages that we get around, whether it's crying or emotions, is, again, a message that we want to stop, we want to quell, we want to essentially just put a lid on it, right? And so we don't really feel like we have that permission to bring out those emotions. So I think, it's kind of a balance. We don't want to just vent and just get angry just the moment that we feel those things, similar to a child. But we have to have time and make time. That's the key. Make time to really feel and process them. So I think of it as observing emotions. It's almost like being lovingly detached from that emotional state. Just kind of observing, oh, wow, I'm feeling really sad right now, or, oh, I'm feeling really depressed. And not having all the judgment around it, but really connecting into that experience. So here's just a little cartoon, of course, really tuning into stereotypes here. But he says, you always complain that I don't know how to show my emotions, so I made these signs. So all the emotions, I don't see anger, grief, and fear as being negative emotions, even though in a lot of the studies they would call these negative moods. I think that we need them. I think we need them for different things, right? And it's only when we deny these things that they become toxic. They become pent up, and then we become explosive, because it wasn't the cap on the toothpaste all those years. It was really not having deep conversations about various things that were important to us. So I'm going to leave you with my 3-step process as to how I work with patients with emotional eating. I've worked with this for a while. So the first one is first becoming aware. Becoming aware in body, in emotions and stress, how you eat. I think that this is first and foremost. And then secondly, develop alternatives for when we do want to emotionally eat, or when we are having a bad mood. And then to get deeper when we can. So for the first part of being aware, I think it's important to really tune people into what they're feeling in the moment. Even for you right now, as you're sitting here. What is the feeling that you have, right? And being able to have that lexicon yourself as you start to dialogue with patients. And then to give them, you might even want to have a handout for patients where you have a list of, these are all the signs of emotional eating, emotional hunger, where you're reacting to your mood rather than listening to your body and what food you need. So emotional hunger is very sudden. Usually it precedes an event, it goes quick, There's a lot of automatic eating, and usually it's for specific foods. Whereas with physical hunger, it's much more connected to the body, and it stops when it's satisfied. It's open to a variety of different foods. So I think even starting there with patients, you could start with deep breathing, getting them centered, making them more bodily aware. How do they know they're hungry? And how is that sign? How does it come through from the body? And then having a distinction here for emotional and physical hunger so they know the difference. And then developing alternatives. So what else can I have to satisfy that need? So in the world of addictions, they often talk about the 15-minute wait out. So within 15 minutes, we can essentially change brain chemistry. So if we walk outside and we walk for 7.5 minutes, we walk back for 7.5 minutes, essentially we are in a different place mentally. Our mood might have changed. So what are some things that they can do during that time? Maybe it's calling a friend. I like the idea of going for a walk or getting some kind of activity to move those feelings through us. So here are some other ideas, right? So I mentioned calling friends. They can exercise, listening to music. That's always a great one. That's usually about 3 or 4 minutes. So, just kind of having something around that. Maybe it's a combination of some of these. And as I mentioned, the languaging of emotions is key in this whole area of trying to define where they're at. So you can go to this website, which is at the bottom, and you can download this, or just go to Google and just type in feeling wheel, and this will come up. This is pretty well known and all over the internet. I like this, and I have used it with some patients because sometimes they are at a loss. They just give me the fine, I'm doing okay, I could be better, but you really want them to tease through. And even if they say, well, I'm feeling sad, you want to know, is it sad or are you tired? Are you bored? Are you feeling lonely? Let's go into that a little bit more. Are you feeling depressed? So this gives you some words around each of those main emotions in the middle. I think it's important for patients to be specific as to what they're feeling too, and really not just let go of things that they just rationalize and say, well, I shouldn't really be upset about that because I'm a spiritual person, and I should really be forgiving and, just let that go. Well, I think we need to pay attention to those little and important hurts that we think are unimportant. I think journaling for some patients is good. I have an emotion log that I use with patients, so it's very, very simple. So it just lists all the emotions, all the days of the week, and then at the end of the day, they just kind of go through and check the boxes that are relevant. Which emotions did they feel? And it's fascinating because you get people coming back with it, and you see the check marks for angry. I remember one patient, and the check marks were like flying. I could just really tell that person was angry. And so then when they see that, and then we look at what they're eating, we start to see that there are patterns between the emotions that they're consistently feeling and how that translates into their food choices. So feeling emotions in the body is important. One of the questions that I'll ask a patient is, when you're emotional, where do you feel it? And some people will say, oh, I feel it in my throat, like I just get that knot, or I feel it in my chest, my heart starts to beat, or my skin gets flushed, or I feel like I have to go to the bathroom, my gut gets uneasy. So have them tune into where they feel it in their body, because it comes through us, right? It's something that we can't hide. We see it in the heart. This is one of the first places, and many patients will mention this to you. And we see this in the nice studies from HeartMath around heart rate variability. So looking at the balance between the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system and seeing if somebody is frustrated, we can actually see that frustration coming through the heart rate, right? Versus somebody that's in the mode of appreciation, where we have this nice sinusoidal type of rhythm. So really being in that space of compassion in the heart. HeartMath, again, has done so many nice studies on having people in that state of forgiveness or compassion, that can really change the nervous system activity. And so what I'll do is I will mention this idea of when you sit down to a meal, conjure up a memory, if it's not apparent for you in that moment, of when you did feel love. try to get your heart to really expand. And I even encourage patients to use a heart-shaped bowl or a plate to, again, and put heart stickers on things like their water bottle, to have that sense and reminder of compassion and love for themselves, because many of them with eating disorders do not have that recognition. So seeing love and fear as the two big buckets of emotion, right? But really we can tease those out. So this is a simple workshop exercise that I'll do with patients, especially fun to dialogue as to what they found. So I'll say, pick an emotion on the left side. Everybody will pick one. They don't say what it is. And then I'll ask them how that feels in their body. So, right, these are all the emotions we would like to have. And then on the right, I'll have them do that. Pick one of those and then feel it in their bodies. And then we have a dialogue about it. Did you, and typically what I hear from them is that the ones on the right manifest in the body differently than the ones on the left. So even see that for yourself if you have that. And for others, they might have some similarities, like in the heart. I have used the functional medicine timeline in a little bit of a different way. So I bet many of you are very, know about functional medicine, or you've done some functional medicine training. Yes, you know about the timeline. So what I do is I take a timeline, I just make a horizontal line with them, and I have them talk with me about their 10 top eating events. And we plot them with the age or the year, and then what happened. And we make it pretty concise, because otherwise you can be there a long time going through their events, which is why I cap it at 10. You may even want to tell them 5, and just work with the top 5 events, and then kind of backtrack. And as you move towards the earlier part of their lives, what you're going to see is that a lot of these eating behaviors started very young. And a lot of those memories will start to come out. It may even be a very emotional exercise to do. This was a study showing that exactly what I just mentioned, that the food-mood pathways seem to be anchored in childhood memories about dinner time, and a lot of childhood connections and parental attitudes towards food. So there's something about that dinner time experience. Maybe you want to ask them about that. The form that I use to capture their information is a little bit more diverse. I have them do not just a food journal, but a lifestyle journal as well, and I have it all on the same page, so that I'm seeing that how they're eating is how they're living is how they're eating. I wanted to bring this up for all of you, that doing telephone coaching, or however you choose to engage with patients, it doesn't always have to be in person, working with them on that, but just phone checking in, accountability, really letting them know that you're connected to their process is really important. And in fact, there are studies now showing that virtual coaching, in some cases, even in obese patients, can be better and better have better compliance for the patient long term if they're obese, right? Obese, overweight patients, and having that freedom to speak freely without feeling like they're judged in person. So I want to end today on this. I think that this is always a fun thing to do, and this is how I got to the root of the potato chip exercise. So what I'd like to do is typically have somebody volunteer a craving, right? And we're not going to have the time to do that per se, but I'd like you all to think about a food that you feel a certain emotional connection to. So it might be cheese, it might be bread, pasta, there might be some ethnic dish that you feel this close affinity to. And then I'd like, if you have a piece of paper and a pen or something to write on, even a computer, just something, and just to write down 5 words that come to your mind when you think about this food. And just really make it, just open it up. Just go with the first 5 things that come out. And normally I would do this 20 times with a patient, but let's just do it very quick, just 5 things. Just write them down and see what you come up with. Wonderful, everybody. Well, I hope that this has been informative and has given you some tools to take into your clinic. Feel free to contact me if you need to. Thanks so much.